If you consider South-South cooperation to be taken care of by emerging countries like India, China, Brazil, then you should better forget South-South cooperation. South-South cooperation is a very determined collaboration across southern countries. India, China, Brazil are just three of them. There are 130 countries other than them who are also a part of South.
No, by
We
all
should
means,
not
well,
and must not consider South-South cooperation to be led by three-fourths other countries. So aid is not development cooperation. Aid alone cannot be said to be development cooperation. That is the North-South perspective of development cooperation. South-South cooperation did not depend only on aid. Rather, aid was the least important component in South-South cooperation.
no, I'm giving you another
Yeah,
example.
yeah,
I had it in mind.
yeah.
So, Rwanda is doing well in governance over the last 10 years or so. And it's become an example in East African community. And whenever you participate in conversations in that region, that comes as an example. DRC requires uh, the knowledge, the sharing of good practices of that governance, and it is a neighbor. And who but Rwanda and other neighboring countries would understand better what are the the tribal, the cultural compulsions that DRC has in improving its governance. Now, if even if Kigali wants to go to Kinshasa, it needs money. So, should African Development Bank step in? How will that work out to keep your principles of South-South cooperation intact, while at the same time ensure that there is impact on the ground? So, Professor Chakrabarti, thank you very much for joining us for this conversation. With your expertise, we want to learn something about where development cooperation is going. So, let me start with an idea that development cooperation traditionally has been going on, it has been happening for a long time, but predominantly as aid from developed countries to developing countries. More recently, South South cooperation has gained a lot of prominence in the discourse, uh, which is a cooperation amongst developing countries. Why has that happened? And what is the difference between this North South cooperation that we saw traditionally and South South cooperation that is now gaining prominence?
Well, this is a very interesting story. You have been saying that development cooperation are popular for quite some time. But I would like to be very specific. The development cooperation came into our literature only about 70-75 years back, when many of the countries were decolonized and they became independent politically. They became independent to take their political decisions. But fortunately or unfortunately, these countries did not get much economic independence. They were still dependent on support from their colonial masters for quite some time. And they were in a position where it was realized that, well, for them to develop, for them to be economically independent, they require certain support from the developed countries. And that gave rise to the idea of development cooperation. The idea was that these developing countries they do not have enough financial resources to buy the capital goods that they require for their development, number one. And number two, since they were not much engaged in foreign trade, they do not have much access to foreign reserves, foreign currencies. So even if they have resources, they cannot buy the foreign capital because they lack in foreign currencies. So these are the two reasons which led to the development of the idea of development cooperation. And this idea got support from a success of the Marshall Plan introduced by the USA during just after Second World War to help the European countries which were sort of uh, consider facing a problem of support to come out of the destruction caused by the Second World War. Marshall Plan was successful, and that was the fillip for President Truman to argue that, well, we'll use this model for developing countries as well. And there was another fear, the threat of the Russian bloc, because President Truman was under a concurrent belief that if this is not done, then these decolonized countries may go the Russian way. So that was also one of the reasons as to why development cooperation had to come into the picture. And incidentally, in 1961, the OECD was framed, and before that, US aid was created, and within 3 4 years, all the developed countries created their development agencies, and they all participated in this process. So, this is how North South development cooperation idea came. But there is also a misconception. The misconception is that South South cooperation came much late. But you should note that the idea of South South cooperation first came in 1954 with Bandung Conference. It came much before the North South cooperation in its present form came into the picture. But South South cooperation was not just limited to economic cooperation, it was also extended to initiate political cooperation and social cooperation and help each other from that perspective. So, South South cooperation should not be confused to have come into the situation only recently. It came even before the North South cooperation came into the picture.
Oh, that is interesting. So basically, the since the money was flowing more from the north to the south, the prominence given to north-south cooperation at that time is explained. But on the other hand, now it is seen that the north-south cooperation or the northern aid is declining or at least plateauing. Now, keeping that in mind, should we think that south-south cooperation will be a substitute for north-south cooperation, or would it address as a supplement to north-south cooperation some of the unique challenges that developing countries face, and therefore the developing countries who participate in such south-south partnerships would be able to better address those challenges?
I think this is a question which has a very much ground in global politics. It is not just an economic issue to be considered here. The point is, if you have a look at the history of Global South, you will realize that all of them are sufferers of colonization. You may say that, well, Latin American countries were decolonized long before, about 100 years prior to the Asian and African countries, but they were also colonized. And the colonization was based on one word that has to be kept in mind all through and even today. The word is extraction. Colonization was based on the term of extraction. Colonization extracted human resources, firstly in the form of slave laborers, and then in the form of indentured laborers, and then in the capitalistic system, the exploitation of labor was very much prominent, and it is prominent even today. And the second level of extraction was the extraction of natural resources. Most of the colonial countries were running short of required natural resources for development. And the colonies were the sources of these resources. So, the global south is a result of historical extraction of these southern countries. You have to keep that in mind very carefully. And that extraction was not just economic, it was political and social as well. Political institutions were changed according to the institutions prevailing in the colonial countries. Social norms were changed according to the social norms existing in the colonial countries. So the colonized countries were exploited, extracted economically, politically, socially. And in this process, something was also done which was not that prominent in the earlier years, but now we have come to realize that they were extracted environmentally and ecologically as well. So these extractions at several levels continued with the countries in Global South during the period of colonization, and that is still going on. It is not that after decolonization the process of extraction was halted altogether.
Is there any difference between the North-South cooperation, development cooperation, and South-South development cooperation?
Of course,
As
there
you
are.
mentioned, it was earlier probably it was more of a like extraction of human resources and natural resources, and now probably things have changed.
Yes, there are 3-4 fundamental differences. I wrote a paper about 4-5 years back where I put them in terms of one term. The idea is that North-South development cooperation is based on a perspective of vertical collaboration. Someone riding at the top of the hierarchy was helping some other countries remaining at the lower end. And this sort of cooperation is suffering from a fundamental problem of loss of trust and reciprocity. So the developed countries which help the developing countries, they could not trust the helped countries completely. So they were more interested in monitoring, evaluation, and putting conditionalities on the use of resources given by them. Whereas South-South cooperation was fundamentally based on an idea of trust and reciprocity because they share the common history. So the sharing of the common history helped them generate more trust among themselves, and they were categorically clear that no conditionalities and evaluations and monitoring in that sense that OECD uses are to be employed. So South-South cooperation was based on horizontal cooperation, and North-South cooperation was based on vertical cooperation. The second one was that the North South cooperation was only interested in giving resources to the southern countries. Whereas South South cooperation realized that just by giving financial resources to southern countries won't solve the problem. They require support in terms of capacity building, they require support in terms of trade among themselves, they require support in terms of technology transfer, and they require support in terms of grants as well. So, this is what we in India term them as a concept of development compact, that these all these components are simultaneously necessary in the form of development cooperation, which was not there, which does not exist in the formulation of North South cooperation. They only believe that we will give the resources and the countries will take care of the rest of the
Very well.
requirements. So, these are some of the basic fundamental differences between North, South, and South South.
So there is more of a stake of the partners amongst South
Yes.
countries
The idea
when
is
a program of
in,
South-South
in
cooperation
the case
occurs.
of North South cooperation, the idea is that the responsibility is to give you resources and you have to take care of them. But my job is to find that you attain those objectives. I am not interested in how you attain them, but ultimately you attain it. Whereas South South cooperation is very much interested to see that the partners are helped even in the process of attaining the goals. So these are the fundamental
So it
differences.
is a kind of a demand-driven
Yes.
exercise. So keeping that in mind, maybe there will be more of, as you said, trust amongst the development partners. And we have heard in literature that the concept of donor recipient does not exist in South-South cooperation. Keeping that in mind, can we find any examples of the character that South-South cooperation has acquired over the years? For example, how different or similar are the approaches of some of the prominent development partners in the South, like India, China, Brazil? Are their approaches similar? Can you have a formulaic perception of South-South cooperation, or is it more project oriented?
I don't think that it is possible to formalize cooperation, because if you create a list of do's and do nots, which is very much necessary to formalize something, you miss the basic flavor and essence of cooperation per se. Because cooperation can be at any level, at any in the context of any problems, and it is very difficult to formalize them. But what I find that, well, there are nowadays discussions about country A not behaving like a southern country, or country B behaving more like a southern country, or country C is very difficult to say whether it is behaving like a southern country. I think these are debates that will continue to go on because of the global political economic system. But I feel that whether a country is behaving like a southern country should be decided in terms of their attitude to the fundamental principles of South South cooperation. South South cooperation believes that it will be horizontal cooperation. There will be no conditionalities. It will be demand driven. The cooperation will not attract any political changes demanded by the partner. So, these fundamental principles, as long as they are maintained, I call anybody a southern country. even if it may be one of the northern countries, even if they believe in these principles, I won't mind calling them a South-South partnership in a country engaged in South-South cooperation.
So this horizontality that you talked about seems to be the axis on which
Yes,
South-South cooperation moves. Horizontality can also be, as you have mentioned just now, uh, can also be seen in North and South countries working together for a third developing country, which is triangular
Triangular
cooperation.
triangular
cooperation.
cooperation. Yes.
So, how is South-South cooperation and triangular cooperation becoming a part of the larger development cooperation scenario? And what do you see in the future, countries like India, China, Brazil, Mexico, collaborating with some of the northern partners so that there is a coagulation of the resources, financial resources, capital, but also sharing of technical and technological lessons that developing countries have learned from their own growth pathways?
Well, this is another very important question to be understood at this point of time. I give my perspective in the sense that there is perhaps a mistake we commit when we try to compare between South South cooperation and triangular cooperation. These two are completely two different ball games. They are not the same. Because as you rightly mentioned, the triangular cooperation means flow of financial resources from northern countries and then using South-South cooperation to help a third partner countries. So it is a mix of South-South and triangular cooperation. It is neither of them.
Mhm.
It is a mix of North-South and South-South cooperation in a very, I would say, mechanical way. And that's why I am very, very categorical on this point that triangular cooperation has not yet picked up its own principles. It has not picked up any principle of its own. OECD has its own principle. South South cooperation has developed its own principles over the last 50, 60 years. But triangular cooperation does not have any principle. It can be a cooperation between three southern countries. It can be a cooperation between two northern and one southern country. It can be a cooperation between one northern and two southern countries.
Or between multilateral development
Or between
banks or
multilateral banks
multilateral
and all.
agencies
So it
and
has
southern
got no
countries.
principles of its own. It's a process, it is an experimentation going on because there are some in the bandwidth of North South cooperation who feel that they should get the better component of South South cooperation to fit into the North South cooperation perspective.
So, in terms of addressing development challenges, what I hear from you is that it is not worthwhile to get into definitional challenges about what is South South, what is triangular, nor is it a a priori need to have some principles on which a cooperation should be forged. It should be based on a demand and the ability
No,
of countries to try.
principles are important.
Principles are important.
Because like if you look, I mean, apart from the development cooperation, development aid from the north or the west, it had beyond development, it had other intentions. They had political intentions. They wanted affiliation. They wanted
South South
affinity.
cooperation also has political.
Exactly. They were
political
there. So, do you differentiate that? Like, for example, then if South-South cooperation also has these kind of intentions, then how do you say that this is vertical and this is horizontal? Maybe you have gone through the same experience, but your intention is that, okay, if I am giving you aid, then you have to be politically aligned with me. You should allow my companies to come in. You should export to me, or you should listen to me, and you should vote for me in the United Nations, wherever it is. So then then how do you differentiate between vertical and horizontal if at the end of the day aim is development plus, a
No, that
political
is why
impact?
I told right at the beginning that South-South cooperation is less dependent on the term extraction. If it also follows the extractive path of development, then it is just a new name, but it is also following the same principles of North-South development cooperation.
Yeah, so this is important.
I am at a loss to, put any straitjacket of that kind to South-South cooperation, but at the same time, there is one, distinct this difference between how North-South cooperation from the northern partner operates and how South-South cooperation, and that is that in the northern countries have agencies which are meant to deliver development cooperation. Those agencies have a certain policy paradigm to operate upon, which policy is a part of the government's foreign policy in almost all cases, and foreign policy has certain strategic objectives. Now, in South-South cooperation, also you are right that there could be strategic objectives in the sense that if India or China or Brazil is undertaking development cooperation in an African country, they would expect that the comity of nations sees them together on the same side of a conversation, of a discourse. That is probably where Professor Milindo Chakrabarti, I think, hit the nail on the head by saying that so long as it is not exploitative, not only in terms of extraction of natural resources or labor, but also not exploitative in terms of the aim behind development cooperation being to get back something. But if it is more in terms of the ability of the development partner which is delivering cooperation to be able to do something through its own experience from where the partner receiving the development cooperation is able to learn. So it is knowledge sharing, technical technology sharing, technical procedures sharing, sharing of good experiences, best practices, that probably drives developing
I
countries. But where is it, why is it that we don't find in several developing countries the same kind of development cooperation agencies that we have in the north? For example, India doesn't have a
I would
agency.
like to raise a very provocative issue. If you consider South-South cooperation to be taken care of by big emerging countries like India, China, Brazil, then you should better forget South-South cooperation. South-South cooperation is a very determined collaboration across southern countries. India, China, Brazil are just three of them. There are 130 countries other than them who are also a part of South. So when we talk of South-South cooperation, we are more interested in finding out the cooperation between, say, Angola and Argentina, or Armenia and Indonesia. So if you just concentrate on South-South cooperation as the domain of India, China, and Brazil, the three big countries, who are themselves concerned whether they should call them North or whether they should call them South. Because some of them are trying to become members of OECD, some of them are even trying to uh, come into a competition with the northern countries. So, under such circumstances, I am very pretty sure that South-South cooperation should not be looked through the lenses of India, China, and Brazil. Rather, the more other countries are brought into the domain of South-South cooperation, the South-South cooperation will become more prominent. And this is more important from the perspective that South South cooperation does not require only financial resources. Other resources can also be shared, trade can be initiated, technologies can be shared, capacity building and knowledge can be shared, and these does not require much of financial resources. So South South cooperation in the real sense of the term will only emerge if we can come out of these three, four big southern countries which are contributing to South South cooperation today, but go beyond that and even can engage the least developed countries in that process.
No, by
We
all
should
means,
not
well,
and must not consider South South cooperation to be led by three, four southern countries.
no, correct, and that also points to the horizontality that
Aid is not development cooperation. Aid alone cannot be said to be development cooperation. That is the North South perspective of development cooperation. South South cooperation did not depend only on aid. Rather, aid was the least important component in South South cooperation.
No, but like when you do a development cooperation, what do? That you share, number one, you share your projects, you share your technology, you share your human resources, training skills. I mean, maybe you give concession for trade and all. These kind of things are required. So they select two countries at the similar level. I think, unless there are some geographical advantage, does not do that. You have to have a big, for example, like if India can be a development partner for Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh and all, because one large country and then you have smaller countries and we can share our experiences of the development. But probably like if you look at the Nepal and Bhutan, at the same level of thing, I mean, except maybe few things, there won't be much
Do you know there is
development
an
cooperation.
experiment
I think
carried
that
out
is
by
not correct.
Isimode.
Yeah.
There was an experiment carried out by Isimode
Hmm.
between India, Nepal, and Bhutan to maintain the ecosystem of that region. Indian ecosystem cannot be maintained if Bhutan and Nepal does not cooperate. So that is also development
Yeah.
cooperation.
Yeah, this is
So the point is, we should not just look into economic development cooperation. There are development cooperation possible at several levels, and they join hands together. I give you an example of Indian development cooperation in Mozambique. India gave some letter of credit to Mozambique to construct factories, facilities to produce solar panels. And once the letter of credit was given, it was found that Mozambique does not have enough human capital to run those facilities. So India provided capacity building program to train their resources into getting ideas about solar panels. Then it was found that they do not have enough opportunities to export the solar panels to other African countries. Then India made it possible for Mozambique to engage in export of solar panels to other countries.
Hmm.
In that context, India even decided to construct railway lines.
Hmm.
So, the project specific arguments that, well, I give a project and that kind of it cannot be development cooperation. It is cooperation, economic cooperation. But
But
for
I think
development cooperation, you have to take care of the other requirements of development as well.
but
So
that
that's
only proves what Mr. Saqib is
yeah.
saying, in the sense that if you want an impact of your development cooperation initiative, there is a requirement to commit resources So let me take an example where
No, I just
none
said,
of the.
can you have the same thing like Ethiopia and Congo?
No, I am giving you another
Yeah,
example.
yeah,
I had it in mind.
yeah. Okay.
So Rwanda is doing well in governance over the last 10 years or so. And it's become an example in
Yeah.
East African community, and whenever you participate in conversations in that region, that comes as an example. DRC requires uh, the knowledge, the sharing of good practices of that governance, and it is a neighbor. And who but Rwanda and other neighboring countries would understand better what are the the tribal, the cultural compulsions that DRC has in improving its governance. Now, if even if Kigali wants to go to Kinshasa, it needs money. So, should African Development Bank step in? How will that work out to keep your principles of South-South cooperation intact, while at the same time ensure that there is impact on the ground?
No, the point is this is another important component that is necessary to be looked into. That we should not, we should consider the multilateral banks as a very important source of finance. And there is a recent effort to create MDBs linking towards the South-South cooperation principles, like the BRICS banks or African Development Bank or others. But there are critics against them that they are also trying to follow the same path of the existing powerful MDBs. So, my perspective is that if these MDBs create a new framework of development cooperation on their part, that will play a very important role in facilitating the growth and development of the South-South cooperation, because they are to move away from the path that they are following. And one point is very important here, that is, I am repeating it, I told it maybe, that South South cooperation should not depend on three, four big countries, resource rich countries, giving out resources to other partner countries. India also has to learn a lot from other countries. There is no denial of this fact. And then, if we agree with that, then and only then South-South cooperation becomes horizontal. Otherwise, in the name of these three, four countries coming in the forefront, we are trying to turn it into also a vertical process of development cooperation.
That's interesting. There is another point that I thought is something which is specific to South South cooperation. In the North South cooperation paradigm, there is an attempt to give a governance model or a democratic practices as a part of the delivery of development cooperation. Whereas in developing countries, since they are all of them resource constrained and they are going through
Yeah.
those development pathways, maybe the mutual interest is what can drive an increase towards South South cooperation.
No, I would just like to differ a little bit. The developing countries are not resource constrained. They are the supplier of resources to the entire world. The problem is that they don't have the control over the resources, which is mostly controlled by the northern countries.
Or their companies.
So you should not make it a point that the developing countries are suffering from resource constraints. They are suffering from control over resources. Resources are there. No, that is the fundamental challenge, and I am saying that we should not be that keen to say that, well, we can do it in 3 years or 4 years. It will take some time, but the idea has to be acceptable to most of us that we cannot develop unless and until we join hands together. We cannot develop at the will of the donor countries. We have to develop on our own terms, on our own ways, through our own development pathways that we identify to be better. And for that, I am repeating it, I don't require India, Brazil, or China to show the way. I, being a resident of Papua New Guinea, I can also find out my partners alongside me or some others to find out as to how we want to develop. As long as we are following the fundamental principles of South-South cooperation, we can do whatever way we want to.
Okay, Dr. Chakrabarti, thank you so much. It was indeed a pleasure talking to you, and it was a lot of learning for us and probably for our viewers. Thank you, Atul, for conducting such a fantastic
Thank you, and
talk.
thank you, Dr.
Thank you
so
very
much.
much.
Pleasure.